Hi guys. Today's subject is a pretty interesting one. Many people are looking for the soulmates, and so I'm gonna give some tips on how to stay sane while you're searching for your soulmate. This is a basic belt-shaped curve, and it basically represents the distribution of a population of people. Let me see. Yeah, I get this. You can see my arrow moving here. So this is the bell-shaped curve, and you could represent um, just about anything. For example, height. There are short people. Most people are of average height, and there are some people who are really tall. Also, weight. There are very light people. Most people are of average weight, and there are some very heavy people. Also, strength. There are people who are pretty weak, and then most people have average strength, and some people are really strong. Same thing with speed. Some people are slow. Most people, the greater percentage of people have average speed, and there are some people who are really fast. Physical attractiveness, there are people like me uh, who's pretty unattractive, so I would be down here. Most people are of average physical attractiveness, and there's some people who most people would regard as being very attractive physically. Intelligence. Once again, someone like me with low intelligence would be represented down here. Most people have average intelligence, and there are some people who are really, really smart. The question is, what about spiritual uh, development? What about moral development? And why's the bell-shaped curve not? Uh, why does that not apply? Well, I think it does. I think there are people uh, who are pretty low on the spiritual um, plane. Uh, the majority of people are kind of along this average or the medium level of spiritual development, and there are a small percentage of people who are highly spiritually developed. Um, so this is just the basic principle here. Now, the next slide here just shows it's just a model, a simple graph of the spiritual path. Let's say we start off here, so uh, will be low spiritual development, and then we get to a moderate level, and then finally we reach a very high level of spiritual growth. Here's another slide here. Once again, spiritual development. This just represents the bell-shaped curve representing distribution of a population of people. Um, I'm going to borrow the terms uh, for moral development because moral development and spiritual development, they really run side by side. But I'm going to use the terminology borrowed from Lawrence Kohlberg um, from Harvard. Um, um, Most people here, about 94% of Americans have um, what I would call conventional level of spiritual development and moral development. There's a small percentage, about 3 to 5% of Americans have pre-conventional um, spiritual development. Um, and the term pre-conventional for not having a conscience. So pre-conscience, they have not developed a conscience. So about 3 to 5% of Americans do not experience guilt, or their guilt is very negligible, it's very remnant. So they, to the point that they hardly have a guilt. Uh, they hardly experience guilt. Luckily, the majority of Americans, 94%, have a conscience, and that's conventional development. And finally, post-conventional development, less than 3% of Americans have reached such a high level. Post-conventional, because they've gone beyond conventional. Conventional people basically follow the law. They believe in being law-abiding citizens, with exceptions. For example, if they believe they can get away with it, uh, then they may commit an unjust act or even a criminal act. But mostly, in general, they're law-abiding citizens. Post-conventional people have this belief that there are universal principles that are more important than man's law, um, and and they have a highly developed conscience, and and we can also describe stages for every level. There are 2 stages. Let's see. Yeah, okay. Um, One thing I want just to mention here, here's the spiritual path again. People go through stage 1, 2, 3, 4, and then they reach the post-conventional level of spiritual and moral development. And the key point is that being on the spiritual path is that these people are secure. You know, they have a very a good sense of security. Now, unfortunately, there's a phenomenon, what I call derailment. People get derailed frequently very early on in their childhood, but derailment can take place anytime in someone's lifetime. And once they get derailed, I use the term shallow path, because they're on this path that is off the spiritual path, but it mirrors the spiritual path. It runs parallel. Okay, and unfortunately, many people who have been derailed and are living the life in this shallow path don't know don't know it. They if the derailment takes place early on in life, then they are not even aware of this spiritual path, and they only know the shallow path. And the main characteristic is that these people are insecure, and the term, unfortunately, is not a very positive connotation, but the term is ignorance. They tend to be ignorant of spiritual and many other subjects. So once again, spiritual path, people get derailed, and then they end up on the shallow path. But in actuality, people get derailed. It could be mild, or they can be moderate or severe. So I could use the term, for example, 1A for mild, double A would be moderate, triple A would be for severely derailed. There's a term called neurosis. But however, when people are derailed mildly, they don't really qualify for the diagnosis of neurosis or any DSM diagnosis. somewhere around a moderate level, that's when people begin to fit the criteria for a diagnosis in the DSM, including anxiety disorders, mood disorders, and personality disorders. So moderate to severe. Um, but sometimes I use the terminology non-neurotic for mild or minimal neurosis. But well, terminology is that well, it's not neurosis. It does not meet the criteria until it's moderate. So people with minimal mildly derailed, they may have certain quirks. They have quirks in the behavior, but not sufficiently symptomatic to be clinically diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder. Now, once again, this shows the spiritual path, derailment, and then people who are living on the shallow path, just for simplicity sake. I'll leave out the mild, moderate, or severe. When I say derailed or neurosis, that means is at least a moderate level. Since most people have conventional moral development and they're looking for a soulmate, a long-term relationship, and hopefully marrying somebody that is compatible with them. So I'm going to concentrate on the conventional people with a conventional level of spirituality, and I won't say much about the pre-conventional level or the post-conventional level. So about 47% of people are at stage 3. So let's start off with that. So people who have a low self-esteem and they're on the spiritual path, that means they're secure. Basically, they're followers in society. And because they're secure, they don't have any problem with that. They don't mind being followers. Being a leader is not something that they aspire toward, and they're comfortable being a follower. Okay, but if we look down to people who get derailed and they become, they reach the 3A spiritual level. Basically, what they have is they have low self-esteem. They have double Rami, basically low self-esteem in addition to insecurity. Now, what would be their behavior? What we commonly see is that people with 3A spiritual development, they tend to punish themselves. There are particular things that derail people, such as child abuse, and then they grow up to have 3A spiritual development, and they undergo re-victimization. These people repeatedly put themselves in positions, maybe not consciously. There's a strong unconscious component to it. They're not even aware of it, but they put themselves in risky situations where they end up getting hurt, and at an unconscious level, they are punishing themselves. Now, let's look at people who are at stage 4, conventional level of spiritual development. The difference between stage 3 and 4 is that as people grow spiritually, they begin to gain a higher level of self-esteem, which is a characteristic of stage 4. Now, if they are secure, then basically they want to be leaders, and they're comfortable. They're secure in the leadership positions throughout society. Unfortunately, for people who are derailed and then they reach stage 4A level of spiritual development, guess what their behavior tend to be? 3A people, low self-esteem and they're insecure, they tend to punish themselves. But you have high self-esteem and you're insecure, that leads to a phenomenon that we call threatened egotism. In other words, these people can be very friendly and nice and behave in a ordinary or normal fashion. They could fit right in with society in situations where they feel secure. On the other hand, if they're in situations where their ego is threatened, then these people act out and they tend to punish other people. So a common terminology for people with stage 4A spiritual development is authoritarians. These people are basically authoritarians who have control issues, um, and all these things is basically I discuss more in the personality profiling. But for today's purposes, in terms of finding a soulmate, I think that's enough for us to get an understanding of, for most people, conventional moral and spiritual level development. Okay, stage 3 and 4, and stage 3A and 4A.